By August 1942, just 8 months after Pearl Harbor, the strategic reality facing Japan had become undeniable. The Battle of Midway in early June had resulted in the catastrophic loss of 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with over 100 trained pilots. Then, on August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, beginning the first major Allied offensive against Japan. The war's momentum had shifted dramatically, and Japan's window of opportunity, predicted by their own strategists to last only 6 to 8 months, had slammed shut. Japanese military strategists were keenly aware of the unfavorable discrepancy between the industrial potential of the Japanese Empire and that of the United States. They reasoned that Japanese success hinged on their ability to extend the strategic advantage gained at Pearl Harbor with additional rapid strategic victories. By August 1942, that strategy lay in ruins. Pearl Harbor, tactical brilliance, strategic disaster. The December 7, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor achieved remarkable tactical success. Japanese aircraft destroyed more than 180 U.S. aircraft and sank or damaged 21 ships. The attack killed 2,403 Americans and wounded 1,178. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged in what appeared to be a devastating blow to American naval power. But the attack contained fatal flaws that would doom Japan's war effort. The American aircraft carriers were not present at Pearl Harbor. One had been scheduled to return the day before the attack, but was delayed by bad weather. More critically, the Japanese attack spared the fuel tank farms, naval yard repair facilities, and submarine base, all of which proved vital for Allied operations in the ensuing months. The psychological impact proved even more catastrophic for Japan. The attack unified the American people in their determination to go to war. President Roosevelt called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Far from demoralizing Americans into seeking negotiated peace, Pearl Harbor ignited an unquenchable determination to achieve total victory. Japan had fundamentally misread American character. They assumed a democratic, materialistic society would lack the will to endure a long, costly war. Instead, after Pearl Harbor, American industrial production, already the world's largest, doubled in size over 4 years, with women entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers and war production running around the clock. The industrial chasm. By mid-1942, the staggering disparity in industrial capacity between Japan and the United States became impossible to ignore. Even though the majority of America's war-making potential was slated for use against Germany, there was still plenty left over for use against Japan. The numbers told a devastating story. In the 3 years following Midway, Japan built 6 aircraft carriers, while the United States built 17. American industry provided almost 2/3 of all Allied military equipment produced during the war. 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million army trucks. America launched more vessels in 1941 than Japan did in the entire war. By 1944 alone, the United States built more planes than Japan produced from 1939 to 1945. This wasn't just superior production, it was overwhelming, insurmountable dominance. Even if Japan had lost catastrophically at Midway, the United States Navy would have achieved parity with Japan in carriers by September 1943 and enjoyed nearly 2-to-1 superiority by mid-1944. The war's outcome was becoming a matter of simple mathematics. Midway, the turning point. On June 4th to 7th, 1942, at the Battle of Midway, U.S. forces sank all 4 Japanese fleet carriers present, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Japan lost approximately 3,057 men, 1 cruiser, and hundreds of aircraft, while the United States lost approximately 362 men, 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and 144 aircraft. What made Midway so catastrophic wasn't just the loss of ships, it was the irreplaceable loss of expertise. The Japanese lost 110 aircrew at Midway, representing nearly 25% of the aircrew embarked on the 4 carriers. While this wasn't immediately crippling, Japan's Navy had 2,000 carrier-qualified aircrews at the war's start, and replacing losses proved increasingly difficult. The battle revealed Japan's critical intelligence failure. U.S. codebreakers had broken Japanese naval codes and knew the attack target and timing. The Americans set an ambush with their carriers positioned northeast of Midway before the Japanese attack began. Japan was fighting a war where the enemy could read their orders, an almost impossible disadvantage. The Doolittle raid in April 1942, where B-25 bombers launched from USS Hornet bombed Tokyo, had prompted Japan to accelerate the Midway operation. The raid shattered the myth of Japan's homeland invulnerability and forced defensive redeployment of resources. What should have been a calculated offensive became a hasty operation driven by wounded pride, and it ended in disaster. The attrition crisis. By August 1942, Japan faced a pilot crisis that would only worsen. The pre-war Japanese Naval Aviation Force represented the world's elite, pilots with 800-plus hours of flight training and years of experience. But these irreplaceable veterans were dying at an alarming rate. At Coral Sea in May 1942, Japan lost the light carrier Shoho and many aircraft from Shokaku and Zuikaku. Approximately 90 Japanese aircraft with their crews, including experienced squadron leaders, then came Midway's devastating losses. The grinding Guadalcanal campaign, which would rage until February 1943, consumed pilots at a rate Japan couldn't sustain. Meanwhile, the United States trained thousands of pilots monthly through dozens of new flight schools established in 1942 to 43. The U.S. Naval Aviation Program alone produced well over 20,000 pilots in 1943. American losses could be replaced. Japanese losses could not. Every veteran Japanese pilot killed represented institutional knowledge that died with him. By 1943 to 44, the qualitative difference would become stark. At the June 1944 Battle of the Philippine Sea, nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, inexperienced Japanese pilots flew into slaughter against veteran American aircrews. The attrition war Japan couldn't afford had begun in earnest in August 1942. Overextended empire. The Guadalcanal landing on August 7, 1942, marked the beginning of Allied offensive operations in the Pacific. U.S. forces seized Henderson Field, establishing a strategic airbase that allowed land-based aircraft to dominate surrounding waters. Japan's rapid conquests of late 1941 and early 1942, spanning from the Indian Ocean to the Central Pacific, had created a defensive perimeter thousands of miles long. Resources had to be dispersed across dozens of isolated garrisons. Japanese planners completely missed the timing of the Guadalcanal landing, considering it inconceivable that it was anything more than reconnaissance. They estimated 2,000 Marines on the island when there were over 10,000 early in the campaign. The strategic asymmetry was fatal. America could choose where and when to attack, concentrating overwhelming force at selected points. Japan had to defend everywhere at once with dwindling resources. The Guadalcanal campaign lasted 6 months, with Japan losing 24,000 men killed while Americans sustained 1,600 killed in action, plus several thousand from disease. The naval battles around Guadalcanal cost each side 24 warships, but Japan's losses, 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, 1 light carrier, 11 destroyers, could not be replaced at America's pace. Every ship sunk, every plane destroyed, every pilot killed, pushed Japan further behind in a race it was already losing. The submarine stranglehold. While carrier battles captured attention, American submarines were methodically destroying Japan's economic lifeline. Japan's entire war strategy depended on securing oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, and other resources from conquered territories. All had to be shipped to the home islands through increasingly dangerous waters. Japan assumed that with the U.S. committed first to defeating Germany and losses inflicted at Pearl Harbor, it would take Americans at least 12 months to launch an offensive. 1 week after making this assumption, the American landing at Guadalcanal toppled all their tonnage projections. Japanese merchant shipping losses were accelerating. While actual figures for mid-1942 were still modest, around 15 to 20 ships monthly, the trend was ominous. By 1943 to 44, American submarines would sink 40-plus ships per month, with some months seeing over 100 vessels destroyed. Although Allied sabotage had made it difficult for Japan to restore oil production to pre-war peaks, the greater problem became transporting oil to Japan through submarine-infested waters. Japan's shipbuilding capacity couldn't keep pace with losses. They could construct perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 tons of merchant shipping annually, but by 1943 to 44, they would lose ships faster than they could replace them. By late 1944, Japan would face economic collapse. Factories lacking raw materials, cities without food and fuel, and a navy unable to sortie for lack of oil. The arsenal of democracy. President Roosevelt set staggering goals for American factories: 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943, 120,000 tanks, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns. Shipyards turned out tonnage so fast that by autumn 1943, all Allied shipping sunk since 1939 had been replaced. The transformation was breathtaking. In 1941, U.S. military aircraft production was less than 3,000 planes annually. Adolf Hitler was told American production goals were propaganda. By war's end, U.S. factories had produced 300,000 planes, and by 1944 produced two-thirds of all Allied military equipment used in the war. This production miracle occurred while simultaneously fighting Germany, the more dangerous threat. The Europe First strategy meant the Pacific received secondary priority, yet still received more resources than Japan could match. By war's end, more than half of all industrial production in the world would take place in the United States. Japan's military planners had known these disparities before the war. Because of the unfavorable industrial discrepancy, they reasoned that Japanese success required extending the strategic advantage gained at Pearl Harbor with additional rapid victories and decisive destruction of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. By August 1942, they had achieved neither. No path to victory. By mid-1942, Japanese strategists faced an inescapable conclusion. There was no viable path to victory. They couldn't win a war of attrition. They couldn't replace losses as fast as America. They couldn't defend their overextended perimeter. They couldn't stop the submarine campaign. They couldn't match American industrial output. Some hoped that inflicting heavy casualties might sap American will, forcing negotiated peace. This hope was delusional. Pearl Harbor had enraged Americans beyond any possibility of compromise. News of Japanese atrocities, like the Bataan Death March in April 1942, further hardened American resolve. The United States had mobilized for total war and would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. Moreover, American tactics evolved to minimize casualties while maximizing firepower. U.S. forces used overwhelming naval bombardment, air superiority, and material advantages to grind down Japanese positions. Methodically, America fought an industrial war, treating it as a production problem to be solved through superior resources and logistics. The window closes. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had predicted Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but beyond that, had no expectation of success. Events proved him tragically prescient. The Battle of Midway occurred 6 months after Pearl Harbor, marking the transition from Japanese offensive to Allied initiative. The Guadalcanal landing came 8 months after Pearl Harbor, beginning the Allied counteroffensive that would not cease until Japan's surrender 3 years later. By August 1942, that predicted 6 to 8 month window had closed. Japan had lost the initiative at Midway. American forces were landing at Guadalcanal. New carriers were under construction in American shipyards. The submarine campaign was gaining momentum. Industrial production gaps were widening catastrophically. The fatal miscalculation. Pearl Harbor's ultimate failure wasn't tactical, it was psychological and strategic. The attack was meant to intimidate America into accepting Japanese dominance in Asia. Instead, it unified a divided nation with steel determination to destroy militarist Japan completely. American technological skill eventually raised and repaired all but 3 of the ships sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor. Most importantly, the shock and anger Americans felt translated into a collective commitment to victory in World War II. Japan had awakened industrial and military might beyond their capacity to defeat. They had given America unassailable moral justification for total war. They had unified a previously divided democracy into single-minded purpose. They had started a war they couldn't finish against an enemy they couldn't outlast. By August 1942, Japan's best leaders understood these truths. They would fight on for 3 more years, through Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Saipan and Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They would sacrifice hundreds of thousands more lives. But the outcome was already determined by the industrial, material, and psychological realities that had crystallized by summer 1942. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical masterpiece and a strategic catastrophe. Japan had won the battle but lost the war in that first strike. By August 1942, the bills were coming due, and payment would be extracted in full measure over the next 3 years of grinding, inevitable defeat. The path from Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima began with miscalculation, underestimating American industrial power, misreading American psychology, and overestimating their own capacity to sustain a long war. By August 1942, those miscalculations had transformed from strategic errors into existential crisis. Japan's war was already lost. Only the final accounting remained.